Hi everyone, welcome back to SGTV, and today we're going to be talking about safe isolation, not self-isolation. I'm sure we're all sick of hearing that word, and you'll probably hear me say self-isolation at some point during this episode by mistake. But no, we're going to be talking about safe isolation, so a very, very important subject. We have Ryan Dempsey from TCW back on the show, joining us once again. Say hello, Ryan.
Hello, thanks again.
It's good to have you back, mate. And you've been kind enough to put us in contact with Louise Adamson. Louise is a workplace safety speaker. So, Louise, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Hi, morning. Thank you.
So, Louise, I'm not sure if many of our viewers will be aware, but you have quite a personal touch on safe isolation and workplace safety. I think before we get into that story, I think if we can go to you, Ryan, and I'm sure and I hope that our viewers should know what safe isolation is, but just as a generic sort of recap on what it is, would you be kind enough to give us a bit of an overview on that?
Yeah, of course. And let's just put the caveat in there that obviously people will listen to this and say Ryan owns a software company and he's not in the industry. How hypocritical. But I am a fellow of the IET. I am still very heavily involved in defining specifications for housing and writing them and so on. So it is still something that I'm very kind of close to. And in terms of safe isolation, one of the key things from an electrical industry is there are people who do it really well, and there are people who don't do it at all. And safe isolation is, if you, for instance, went to the electricity at work regulations, which is that's the regulations that we all should work to, and it's under regulation 14, working on or near live parts. And there is requirements in there that say, if you're going to carry out certain work and that system is going to be energized when you do it, there are certain precautions you need to take to ensure that you can work safely. That's PPE equipment. But for other circumstances, you need to ensure that that system is dead. Make sure that there is no electricity passing through that conductor or that circuit that you're working on. And that's the safe isolation. And there's a full procedure around it. So everybody's done it. Everybody's done a handheld leaflet. Everybody's done, the GIB have done it. The Electrical Safety Roundtable have done it. The HSE have done it. Martindale have done it, who produced the proving units to do. Everybody's done a safe isolation procedure. I can walk you through it if you want. It's very kind of monotonous in terms of structured process. And if you're going to do it right, you should do it like this. So if you're coming to work on a particular installation, a commercial, industrial or domestic property, you need to ensure that the person who owns that installation is aware that you're about to work on it. So you have to then gain that permission to say, look, I'm going to isolate this supply. And there are reasons behind that, because as an electrician stood at the consumer unit, you might be about to switch something off that's not labeled correctly. That could be life-saving equipment upstairs. Somebody's on a bed that needs an oxygen that's plugged in, and you're going to switch that off. So there's reasons around why you should isolate or obtain permission. You need to identify exactly where you're going to be working, and you need to use a proven unit to make sure that is live, and you can see that it's a live installation before you work on it. You then need to take that proven unit and go and test it on an approving device to make sure that it's working. Switch the supply off, secure it with a padlock and a key and a sign that says, I've seen some really funny signs. You should just say electrician working, but I've seen swear words. I've seen people putting their personality on these signs. And then when you go back to it, you can't just assume that what you've just done there means that system is now isolated, because you've proved it. You've proved your unit. You've gone back. You've isolated it. You've put a padlock. You go back again. You should use your unit, and you should prove to make sure that system is now isolated. There's no current passing through that. But once you've tested your proven unit, you should again test your proven unit on an approved device to make sure that the proven unit's working again. Once you've done all of that you are then safe to work on that system. And that's the safe isolation procedure to ensure that a system is dead before you then carry on the work.
So I think we'll come back to that at some point in this episode, Ryan, and just maybe dissect that a little bit more.
Okay.
And, put some questions out there, whether people are doing it, when they're doing it, why, we'll come to that. But Louise, if it's okay with you, could you just tell us a little bit about what you're doing then.
What I'm doing now is I tell my wee brother's story for him because he can't tell it himself. So he was 26 years old, Michael Adamson. He left the house that he shared with his fiancée in Bo'ness one morning, and he didn't make it home to her that night. He had been working at a job in Edinburgh. He then got called to an all-hands-on-deck job in Dundee by his employer, where they were working to fit out a JJB sports store and a gym complex. It was a job that was due to be handed over to their client the very next day, or else some penalty clauses were going to kick in for the employer. So it's all hands on deck to get this done. He was working on that job with a colleague. They were to install a security system. They needed to connect a cable that was already in place within a ceiling void to one that they'd pulled in themselves. So he cuts that cable that's already in place within the ceiling void. He throws the length of cabling down to his colleague Jim. And there was insulating tape wrapped around that cable, and the words that were written on it were not in use. So as Jim stands up, he notices the false ceiling that Michael's up above sort of rise an inch or two, and he's shouting up, "Mikey, you're leaning on that wire." But, you know, I said it's all hands on deck that night. So among other things, the sound system was being tested. The music was blaring. Every chance Michael doesn't hear him. So Jim has to watch as that ceiling rises ever further, and then the ceiling collapsed and Michael landed at Jim's feet. Because when that ceiling rose, Michael was being electrocuted. So, you know, it takes us quite a long time to find out why that happened, because it took about 3.5 years for it to get into court. And for his employer and their managing director and their operations director and their technical services manager all to be charged with criminal health and safety offences. So it transpires that, yeah, you know, the processes weren't in place that should have been. The equipment that he should have been given wasn't given to him. That there is the likelihood that cheeky wee shortcuts were being taken by the Sparks on that site, indeed on every site. So because of all those health and safety failures, a 26-year-old man who had his whole life ahead of him doesn't make it home. And it's just so very wrong. So what we're trying to do is raise awareness, get people to realise what the correct processes and procedures are, what their rights are at work, and stop this from happening to someone else.
I don't really know how to respond to that. It's not a story you ever want to hear, is it?
It's one of those. The first time I heard Louise tell the story was it was a small group, and there was this kind of deathly silence afterwards and it's not just the realization that a room full of electricians understand that they've been in that position before. Everybody's been in that position before, and everybody's the back of the head realized that do I just get on with it? If I don't get on with it, am I going to lose my job? And that hand to mouth of an electrical industry is the people do unfortunately cut corners. And Louise, bless her, she's traveling around the world. She's standing up in front of companies, and she's given this story about her little brother that she doesn't have to do. She doesn't have to go around the world telling people, look, I care for you electricians, even though I don't know you. It's such an admirable thing to do, to go around and just say, look, ladies and gents in this industry and schemes in this industry, I think Select started to kind of engage, which is fantastic. And this is probably the most important thing in the electrical industry, your safety when you are on site, but also the employer's responsibility to those individuals who are on site. It's not just about you. I know the health and safety executive or the health and safety at work act says that health and safety responsibility sits with the individual. It's your responsibility for yours, but there's also the accountability from the employer's side as well. So You're not alone there in the silence after Louise's story. When you hear the full thing and when you see the video, I think the lump in my throat probably lasted about 2 weeks. It's a horrible story, but it's a beautiful one in the sense that what Louise is doing. So
Yeah, you said to me, Louise, before we started filming, that you were nervous about doing this. I mean, you're braver than me going around doing what you're doing in front of all these big companies. Where do you begin to tackle that? Because, like you say, there's so many things in that sequence of if this job isn't done in time, there's going to be a penalty. You've got other jobs going on, audio being tested. I mean, you could hear so many excuses, and whether they might seem genuine from a company of saying, well, if we don't get this job done on time, there's going to be a penalty because of something else behind me or something else in front of me. It might not necessarily be that individual person there. It might be pressure from another side, which, like Ryan says, everyone's been in that position where if you're up against it, you've got to get something done on time, and there's other things going on time. I'm sure. I mean, when people have been on site, we've been there where we're treading on top of chippies and brickies and getting on top of each other. That's how the industry is. You know, I don't know where you'd begin to sort of tackle that.
Where you begin is with leadership, is with the leadership of a company, the leadership of an electrical contracting company, being able to stand up to their client or to the principal contractor and say, do you know what? No, we simply can't get it done in the time that's left. So we need to have a grown-up discussion about that fact, because we are not going to let one of our employees suffer a shock or worse, simply because you want to get a sports store open, or not even open, just handed over to a client so that they can do the next stage.
When you put it like that, it is just a shop, isn't it? It's not a. Even say, if you used to say it's a hospital or something, let's put the person in there as priority to begin with, I suppose.
Well, the crazy thing is it doesn't take long to do if you do it right. It's not something that you'd have to program in to say, oh, if the job starts at 9 o'clock, we have to send the sparkies in at 6 o'clock in the morning to do safe isolation. It doesn't take that long to do. And I in a past life, when I was a client, I was in court with a contractor who'd received an electric shock off a boiler. And I was being questioned as if I'd done something wrong. Now, it was a contractor that worked for the organisation I worked for, so it was that they were employed by us, but they were governed by a specification that said they must work in accordance with regulations, with guidance, with all of this stuff, and they were trying to sue the authority that I was working for a substantial amount of money because this individual had received an electric shock from a boiler he was working on. Now, it all boiled down to the process that contractor had for that individual in that property at the time. There was no documented risk assessment. There was no document method statement, which clearly defined that before you work on any system, you must ensure that system is dead. There was nothing that said that a particular type of engineer, I'll not go into too much detail, that particular type of engineer who was not an electrician should request an electrical engineer or an electrician to come and make sure that system is dead before they work on, or have training to be able to isolate that themselves. It ended up getting thrown out because they literally didn't do any of the processes that luckily we had defined in our standards, and we governed. We would go out and we would just turn up on site and we would walk straight to the consumer unit. And if that consumer unit was just down with insulation tape over the top of it, that contractor would be told to stand up, pick your tools up, get out, and don't come back until you've got a process in place of locking off and working. So it is down to the leadership team. It's down to the employers. It's down to the people who ultimately are accountable for defining the process that someone must work to. But then, it flips both ways. So
yeah, that's what I often say is, Michael, he wasn't ever backwards and coming forwards. He could stand up for himself. So for me, I don't understand why he didn't challenge this process. But then you think about it, and he's become a product of the environment into which he's been put. So if nobody else is using a lock and a tag, if everybody else is using insulating tape, if his employer hasn't bothered to provide it, if they've not bothered to provide the voltage tester and the proving unit, instead he's only got a multimeter available to him, then, you know, everybody else is doing it. He's just going to do it as well.
It's that pressure as well, though, Louise, isn't it? It's the pressure of, or it's assuming things and the pressure. So Michael will have turned up to that site and he'll have seen that tape round that said not in use. And he will have just trusted the fact that the electrician who put that in had isolated it. And everybody's done it, unfortunately. And having that trust in the company you work for, that the process in place. I receive a phone call and head up to Dundee to do a job. When I turn up to that job, I'm going to assume initially that everything around the safety side of things, I've got my own safety stuff, I've got my boots on, I've got my hat, I've got my gloves. I'm turning up on site assuming that everything is in a safe, it's a safe environment to work. That's kind of different to an electrician who turns up to do the work, solely do the work. When you turn up in a team, who's responsible? And it is their responsibility, but it's also the company's responsibility to say, look, we're going to send all these people there. However, can somebody just please make sure that there's signage out there, somebody has isolated that, everybody knows when they walk on site that this is the things that have been done. And unfortunately, it sounds like there was just too much pressure on that company's heads, that everybody just jumped in to do their bit to make that company succeed on that. And it's there's just far too many kind of small things that can. He might have even said when he was going up the ladder, "Has this all been isolated?" And someone might have shouted, "Yeah, of course it has." And there's just so many kind of differences that could have happened in that whole process.
I mean, what I've been told since by another member of their management team is that, you know, well, God, you know, see, back then, because it happened in 2005. So back then, you know, nobody was doing safe isolation. It was something that was restricted to the offshore industry or oil and gas. Like, they're the only ones that were doing it. It's like, well, that's a pile of bullshit. You know, the apprentices had been taught it since the mid 1980s. So, you know, you're however many years on, 20 years on nearly, from apprentices starting to be taught safe and secure isolation, and it's not been implemented by the electrical contracting industry. So the industry needs to have a damn good look at itself. The sort of governing bodies need to have a damn good look at themselves to say, you know, to what extent were we trying to make our industry a safer place? Because I don't think they were. I think a blind eye was being turned.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Louise, because I don't know if, you know, when you register with a competent person scheme or a scheme in the electrical industry, I know you need to have a copy of regulations. I know you have to have your meter and stuff calibrated. You have to have liability insurance, but I don't know if there's somebody listening to this will no doubt jump in and correct me, but I don't know if there is a tick in a box that says there is a full process of safe isolation and prover units are issued to all members of staff and they're tested to make sure they work. I don't know if that's in there. And if it's not, why isn't it in there? Why isn't that in there?
Yeah, and I've asked the question, you know, do they do sort of unannounced visits to their members to see what actually happens on site? And they don't. It's always announced. So, you know, it's that whole thing of, if you know a visitor's come in, then you'll tidy the blinking house up, won't you? So if you know that somebody's coming to your site, you're going to make sure that that site's operating correctly. But, you know, when Super Rod did a survey of a Facebook electricians community a few years ago, it was found that 1 in 5 don't even carry a lock-off kit in their vans. 20% of electricians still not carrying a lock-off kit in their vans.
That doesn't surprise me, you know, and I'm not going to name names, but the amount of Sparkies I've spoken to, including on this show, who have told me, nah, don't use them, don't use them. And I mean, the cost of them. I mean, we can all agree there's some very expensive kit in an electrician's toolbox, but a lock-off kit, a couple of quid, if that. You know, it's not exactly going to take up a lot of space either. You're talking, you know, it'd fit in your hand. It's tiny. There really is no excuse for it.
The naivety in it, though, is if you're a lot of electricians who I would speak to would say, if I'm working in a void property and there's only me in that property and I switch the system off or I switch a circuit off to work in it, there's no one else there. So why do I need to go through that whole process of locking it off? It's all about attitudes and educating people that it's not about why. It's just, this is a process. If you get yourself into a routine that this is the process that you do, I'm not massively proud of it, but when I was working on the tools and I was working for a council in Yorkshire at the time, and I went to carry out some work on the downstairs ring main, I went to the consumer unit and I switched the downstairs ring main off. And the way that I would isolate that is I put the lock-off kit on there. I never put a sign on because I didn't have it at the time, but I'd lock off that consumer unit, that specific breaker. But I also locked the door. So I was one of those kind of naive people who just thought, I'm in the property, have locked it off, I've proved that I've switched it off. I then went to that socket downstairs and probably had one of the worst belts I had on. I thought I'd lost my fingers. Further investigation found that the individual who'd lived there previously, instead they didn't want to channel out across the living room to that socket, so they found that the cavity from the upstairs bedroom, it was easier to just run a cable down the cavity to where they wanted it to. So when I switched the downstairs ring main off, that one socket on the downstairs ring main was actually powered from the upstairs ring main. So not massively proud of that. It's probably one of the stupidest things I ever did whilst I was on the tools. And it hurt like hell. But that was a very quick lesson for me that you need to prove it, you need to test it, you need to prove it again, you need to make sure that all your devices working. And I guarantee after that, I did it every single time after that, just because I genuinely thought I'd lost my fingers. And a stupid mistake could have been a hell of a lot more costly. I could have had my sister traveling around the country with Louise telling her story because of a brother didn't go through a process in a domestic property, unfortunately. And it's luckily that didn't happen, but yeah, that could happen. It's if you get yourself into a routine that says, look, it's going to take you 3 or 4 minutes to test that, and then put a sign up and lock it off and then test it again to make sure it's dead. Your safety is the most paramount thing, and you've just proved that you're not going to get yourself killed. So
yeah, that's so important, Ryan. That's it exactly. It's that whole, the lock isn't. Of course, it's important, but that's not the whole process. So yeah, absolutely. They just need to get themselves into that mindset that every time I'm going to work on something, I am going to prove my voltage testers are working. I'm going to prove the circuit's dead. I'm going to prove my voltage testers are working again. Absolutely. And it's locked off. And it doesn't matter a damn if there's nobody else in the property. If you're not following that whole process, then as you say, you can get a belt. And I've had Sparkies in my flat and I'm saying to them, are you going to lock off? And they knew what had happened to my brother because they'd previously been in and they'd done a whole rewire. So I'd explained to them then what had happened to him. And I'm saying to them, they come back to change an extractor fan. And I'm saying, are you going to lock off the board or the circuit? Yeah, we'll lock off the circuit, I get told. And I'm running about trying to get my boys ready for school and nursery. I see him up the ladder at the extractor fan. I say to him, have you locked off that circuit? And they had been nowhere near the circuit board. So they got tipped out of the flat because, what he's saying to me is, well, is that switch outside the bathroom door that, operates this, and that's off, so it's fine. It's like, well, that's fine until my 3 or 4 year old son, whose favourite game at the minute has been turning that on because it makes the bloody extractor fan screech. Yeah, it's fine until he does that when you're up there. So, I don't know what we need to do to get through to people, but I guess we can just keep telling them kind of the consequences.
What conversations are you having with these companies? How's that sort of go?
I mean, there's sort of disparate sort of practices going on, I guess. We need to try to do is get these sort of clients and principal contractors to ensure that the good practice is going on right through the chain, because so often when it comes to electrical work, it's kind of subbed out and then it's subbed out, and then, you know, and so it goes on. So the initial intention is good, but then when it comes to actually who's finally doing the job, it's not so good. So I've done some work for Mace, for example, who they put all their health and safety team through a safe isolation course so that they knew what they were looking for when they were on site. Because, you know, if you're going out and doing an inspection of a job, you actually need to know what the good process is that is meant to be going on. So that helps when you've got that sort of oversight going on. But I'm just not sure how we instill that mindset in everyone that, you know, this is something that needs to be done. It's that whole seatbelt thing, like you've put your seatbelt on when you get in the car. We need electricians to get to that mindset when it comes to safe isolation.
Do you feel like you're the people who you do the Mace you mentioned there, but I've seen you've done quite a lot around the world in terms of the Michael story. Do you ever get any follow-on to kind of highlight the changes that those organizations have done? Do you ever get any kind of really positive feedback to say, look, we've implemented this, thank you very much for what you did, it's made a big difference? So
yeah, absolutely. And it's things like, you know, when I first started telling Michael's story, it was for Babcock at Rosyth, where they were building the aircraft carriers. So this isn't something I set out to do. It was something I got asked to do because they'd had a run of electrical incidents and they didn't know what they were going to do to kind of shake things up. So I got asked to go in and speak about what happened to Michael. So I went in to do it as a one-off. But when you go in and do it and you speak to the Sparks, I talk about a part where, like, we don't know the process that Michael followed because only he would be able to tell us. But so, you know, we're left with that number of possibilities that he's either, you know, tested when it was turned off, but then someone's turned it on because it wasn't safely locked off, or else he's tested using his multimeter when he should have had a voltage tester to do that. Multimeter you can't use for proven dead. Or else he's used a cheeky wee shortcut, which is to cut through the cable, and if it goes bang, then it means it's live. If it goes bang, it means it's live. So when I talk about that cheeky wee shortcut, the Sparks in the audience all sniggered because they knew they'd done it themselves. And thankfully, I got asked to go back to that site a number of times afterwards over a number of years. And that cheeky wee shortcut had been hammered out of them. Like the snigger didn't happen anymore when people were coming back. So you know that that's happened. And yeah, there have been instances where, for example, a business is rolling out new voltage testers and is trying to get the guys to not use their multimeter anymore. And you're getting that whole, I've always used my multimeter, I've never had a problem. Well, you only need to have that problem once and you are not going to have that problem again. So yeah, change does happen. It does happen. Just I just wish I could make it happen magically everywhere, I guess.
the problem you've got is that I always say this, Louise, with the electrical industry. One of the really funny statistics in the electrical industry, when people say that they come up with a fantastic new idea and they're going to change the world and they're going to change things very quickly. If you look at the history of the wiring regulations, and in 1993, the 16th edition came out, and the 16th edition came out and specified it. There was RCD was specified in the 15th edition and so on, but RCDs came kind of mainstream in 1993 with sockets for outdoor use. still to this day, 30 odd years on, there's still properties with no RCD protection. And even though there is publications upon publications that say if there's RCDs in a property and it's been tested regularly and they're maintained in the right way, there's a 99% chance somebody would survive if they came into contact with the electrical installation protected by an RCD. Even though that statistic exists, there are still properties throughout the UK that don't have any RCD protection. And that's 30 years on. And it's one of those industries that, and you hit the nail on the head there, which is, I've always done it like this. I have always done it like this. And that change management, and with the likes of COVID coming in the last year and people have had to use internet and use these kind of platforms. Before COVID, people were like, you'll never get me on the internet. You will never get me on the internet. Now everybody's on the internet because they've been forced into it. I often wonder when we talk about safe isolation, whether or not the companies that make the test equipment, I know it's a small bit, but it's not a big thing. They make test equipment. They should have a safety device on there that says, have you carried out safe isolation? And there should be a yes or no for accountability to that Sparky before they carry out any testing on systems. I know that doesn't account for the installation side of things, but if testing equipment have you carried out safe isolation, and when you press yes, it logs that somewhere and it gives it a timestamp, then at least employers will be able to see if something happens, well, he carried out safe isolation, or at least he said he did, or she said she did. I wonder whether or not manufacturers could do more to kind of help with that, rather than just the likes of you kind of pushing the message out there, and other people. That there's quite a few podcasts out there. There's quite a few groups of people out there who are doing amazing jobs in promoting kind of electrical safety and conversations around this is one of them. But are we trying to force the governing bodies and the industry kind of bigwigs who sit in the ivory tower to implement this, when we should be doing more towards manufacturers and test equipment? Should they be doing more? So
yeah, I've often thought as well, Ryan, about, those who produce distribution boards and consumer units, should they supply the lock-off devices with them? Should they be kept at the distribution board or with the consumer unit? So then there's no excuse that you've not got one in your bag. It's there for you to use. You just need your tag showing who has used the lock or whatever.
Great idea. It's a great idea.
So absolutely. Manufacturers is another thing that needs tackled.
Yeah. Where are you been spreading this message then, Louise? Ryan said you've been going around the world. Is that right?
Yeah, I used to, I guess, before COVID hit. I was lucky enough to be asked to go to Australia about 18 months ago to work for naval ship management. So yeah, that was an amazing opportunity, and yeah, I think there's work needing done in Australia on safe isolation for sure. But yeah, I've been a lot of different countries in Europe.
Have you found any in particular who are doing a better job than we are here? We did an episode before about, I think it was Australia and the US, and how they've got some things they're doing better than us, and we're doing some things better than them. But has there been any instances in particular that you think actually they're on the right path, they're doing something right?
No, I'm afraid not. No. Nowhere that I can think of.
That's not a good answer, is it? That's not what we want to hear. No. So Ryan, when we're talking about tools, we've mentioned things like voltage testers, multimeters, and like you say, Louise, everyone out there is saying, well, I've used my multimeter, so should be fine. But what should we be using?
So you need an approved voltage indicator. You can get the Martindale. I apologise for any other manufacturers who do them, but Martindale was always the kind of the preferred one. It might be. This is not a video; it's a podcast. I didn't know whether or not we should kind of show a couple of pictures, and they're not expensive. There's not really much that they need. You need your lock-off kit, which, as you've said, is not expensive. Although if you speak to one of my good friends in the industry, Richard Emery. We went to the Electrical Safety Roundtable meeting down in London, and he brought his lock-off kits with him. And where we see it's not expensive, his collection is expensive. I think he has every lock-off kit for every single fuse, break, anything. It's the most impressive ones that I've seen. But yeah, you've got your lock-off kit, your proven unit. There's not really much more you need to demonstrate that a system is locked off. It's not an expensive piece of...
So for Sparkies that are saying I've used my multimeter, maybe they're not aware of why that's not good enough, but why isn't that good enough?
What I got told is that you can have it set to a wrong selection, giving you a false zero reading. There will be more technical, I'm sure, explanation than that, but that's what I took from the evidence that was given at Michael's trial.
You do have gas engineers now. There's an issue a safety advice came out from, I think it's safety 118 it might be, which is from Gas Safe, and that tells gas engineers to carry out safe isolation. Previously, before that publication came out, you had gas engineers. My brother's one of them. He would use his multimeter, and you've got that dial right through the middle, which has got all the different selections. You're either going to test at 20 ohms, 200, or 20 volts, 200 volts. And Louise is completely right. If you set that to the wrong setting, and you stick it on there, and you're going to get a zero reading, and you're going to think, well, it's clearly dead. Whereas if you knock it up a notch and you put it on there, it's going to see 256 volts, and you're not going to understand that. So the proven unit doesn't have any of those dials on it. It is literally, you've got two ends of that, you push it in, and it'll tell you, it'll light up, it'll have either your 20, your 200, your 400, and it'll tell you whether or not that system is dead. It'll light up if there's power in there. So there's no way of accidentally getting it wrong, if you want to say it that way. So
yeah, so I guess not the proven unit that'll tell you, it's the voltage tester, isn't it? The voltage.
Yeah, the voltage tester that you put against the system to prove that it's dead. The voltage indicator, which is that small device that you get, that you plug your voltage indicator in to prove that it still works.
Yeah.
When you put that, yeah.
I've seen a lot of people using pen testers. I mean, there's loads of different brands of those. Where would you stand on those?
That they shouldn't be used for proving dead. They are simply that. They're an indication of whether voltage is present, but they are not an approved device for proving dead.
I've had instances when I've just been cured, because I've only been in my house a couple of years, so as we're doing renovations and getting people in, I want to have a little bit of an understanding of what's going on where. So I've used a pen tester, not in the back or anything like that, just to see if things are live and dead, like when I found sockets in cupboards, and I can test it one day and it's live, do nothing, test it another day, there's nothing. So that's how reliable I've seen them.
You've got to be really careful with the pen testers, because if you have a 10 mil or a 16 mil PVC cable, and you touch that pen tester on the wrong side of that cable, it might say that there's nothing there, but if you then touch it on the other side where the live conductor is, you'll get it. It'll beep or it'll make a noise. And if you don't hold it close enough to it, they're too unreliable. I've been in situations where I've pulled it out the back pocket, I've touched it on a cable, and it hasn't beeped. And in my head, I've just thought, hang on a minute, there should be power going through that. And then I've gone and tested it properly, and there is. And you think, well, why didn't that pen tester tell me? It's now at the bottom of my tool bag. I haven't changed the battery for it for years, and I don't think I'd ever get it out again because it is so unreliable. But yeah, no, I wouldn't. I would stick to, if you look at the HSE and they define that safe isolation procedure, you go to the GIB, the one that Paul Meenan did with the work-based electrical safety roundtable, that one-page document. All of this guidance and refers, I don't know if GS38, which is the guidance on test meters and how you work, I don't know if that refers to proven units and so on. But there's all this guidance that tells you how to do that because they're proven methods and they're the safest way to do it. So stop cutting corners and saying, oh, do you know what, I'll like a 9-volt battery, put my tongue on the end of it. No, start doing things correctly and more people will not get electric shocks.
Should people be testing every single, let's say you've gone into a house, you've got 15 sockets to change or move or whatever the job is. Should you, once you've done safe isolation, I nearly said self-isolation, didn't I?
Yeah.
Once you've done safe isolation, should you then test every socket, test your tester, next socket, and so on for every single item you're working on.
Anywhere you're working, you should prove that that part of that system is dead. The one thing that you do not know is the electrician who came in before you stuck to all of the rules and all of they wired it up like you would. You might wire it slightly differently. You go into the regulations and you go into the chapter 1 and fundamental principles, and I think it's chapter 34 in BS 7671, which is maintainability. If every electrician installed the system in a way that helped the next electrician who comes in, we'd be a much safer industry, but we're not, unfortunately. You have a specific nuance, or that electrician has a specific way of doing things, so that when you go into that property and you're going to test those 10 sockets round on the ground floor ring, it's exactly the same situation as what I mentioned before. Somebody's done some DIY. I don't want to pay for a plasterer to come in and fill all that. It's got lovely wallpaper I don't want to damage. I'll just run it down the cavity and I'll put a double socket there, and it's from upstairs. I know, doesn't matter, but you then move out of that installation, you move out that property, and if somebody comes in, they don't know that you've done that. They just assume that that socket's on the downstairs. And it's the same with a factory. You don't know how that electrician has wired that cable or that circuit. So the best way to protect you and those around you is to just prove it and make sure that it is dead in the way that you've been taught in school.
I could be off the mark here, but I remember maybe 15 to 20 years ago, being when I was doing like labouring and things like that on site, you'd have building inspectors turn up just at any point, because once you've notified building control that you're going to be doing work on a property, they would turn up whenever they wanted and get you to prove something whenever you wanted. I've seen them have people ripping tiles off the roofs just to prove there's sufficient linings and all sorts. And I know from people who are still doing building that due to funding cuts and things like that, they're not really doing these kind of surprise inspections anymore. They'll do final inspection, which sometimes they're not even getting out the car. They're just looking if the building's still there. Is that the case for electrics as well?
No. So this is a really interesting one, and it's probably a podcast all on its own. What you've got to remember is in 2005, we had Part P of the building regulations and the competent person schemes, and you've got the NIC, Stroma, Alexa, and ECE and so on, and NAPIT. You've got all these competent person scheme who came out in 2005 who defined a specification, and that specification is for notifiable work through building control. The local authorities within specific areas can rely on the fact that you are registered with a competent person scheme to carry out this work. So the local authorities then started to realise, well, why do we need all of these members of staff in local area building control? Because we can now just rely on a self-regulated industry. We can just say, are you a member of a competent person scheme? Yes, I don't need to come and check it, because that's their job. That's their job to make sure that you meet the qualifications, the grades, the competence, and so on. So local authorities and the economy kind of pulled that back, and they saved money on getting rid of the majority of people who were technically competent from a clerk of works perspective, kind of that realm. They've now disappeared. So you're right, 15, 20 years ago, you would have somebody who'd walk up with a clipboard. He'd have an ill-fitted hat, an ill-fitted jet vest with some horrible logo on the back. And he or she would walk in and say, right, can you demonstrate how you did this? Can you just make sure, can you tell me where you've put that RSJ? Can you tell me where you've done this and that? And you would have to prove it to them. And that would go as part of that full portfolio of this work's being done correctly. Now, absolutely not. They would only probably investigate it if you made a phone call and said, I've got a Sparky here, I think he's doing it wrong. They would probably say it, report it to the competent person scheme. They probably wouldn't do anything. So yeah, the industry, although has done probably good with Part P and the competent person schemes, if you look at it from a different angle, it's probably made it less safe in terms of that respect. So,
do you think that's down to funding? Just all down to money?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Louise, where do you think, where are you going to go from here? I know when you said a lot of those people in those rooms were sniggering when you said about, cutting corners. I'd imagine, and I wouldn't like to say this, but I'd imagine some of those sniggers would have probably ended up in a similar position to your brother at some point. And through the work you're doing, like you say, those sniggers aren't happening as much anymore. I would like to think that that's one less person being in that position by just making them aware and giving them a bit of a kick up the backside that they'll need. So where are you going to go from here? Are you going to keep carrying on your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has been difficult through COVID of not being able to tell his story as much as I have in previous years. So I've been kind of concentrating my attentions this past year on a charity that I work with, Scottish Hazards. But yeah, absolutely. I've been delivering Michael's story kind of via a Zoom and Teams and things. So we'll continue doing that, and then once I can get back out, actually on site again, we'll do that. But yeah, you know, there's so much that needs to be done, and I'm very grateful for opportunities like being involved in the electrical safety roundtable. That's been brilliant to kind of bring together individuals from different aspects of the industry with a view to making change, making positive change. As Ryan said, Select have started to engage, which again has been good to see. So yeah, just need to keep chipping away, I think. Nothing else for it.
Where can our viewers find information about what you're doing?
So the website is michaels-story.net.
Okay, we'll put a link in the description of this video, so anyone watching this, you can click that and find out more. Before we finish, I want to thank you both for coming on. As I said to Ryan in a previous video, most people that are out there doing these kind of videos, they're doing it for the right reasons, and I think you, Louise, you're top of that. So quite literally saving lives by doing what you're doing and preventing accidents. So, you know, you're doing brilliant. Just keep it up.
No, thank you. Just you know, I say that he trying to build the legacy for him that he didn't get to leave for himself. So
absolutely.
I think any contractor, any organisation, any kind of employer who employs electricians, I would strongly suggest have the tissues at the ready though, because Louise is amazing at delivering that story. But I would strongly suggest that anybody does get in touch with Louise and just give her an hour of the time for the Sparkies, and it will make a difference. Like you just said there, she probably has, unbeknown to her, saved many lives. And if she just keeps doing what she's doing, she'll save many more. And that it's down to the employers and the leaders of the industry to engage in it in a bit more. And yeah, I'd strongly recommend anybody kind of jumping on the website and getting in touch with Louise for that.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Louise. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks again, Ryan. We'll probably see you again soon.
Okay, good stuff.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for watching. Make sure you're doing what you've been told here. Otherwise, we'll have Louise turning up on site with a big stick, hitting you all. All right then. Thanks again, everyone. I'll see you next time.